All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Jenna Wood, and I am one of the dietitians here with the Giant Company. For those of you who do not know, this is our Wellbeing Connection class for May, our final one for May. We've been kind of talking about allergies and intolerances and just different things that may make you unable to eat certain foods or ingredients and things like that. So I believe Joni talked about dairy and lactose intolerance, and I am going to cover celiac disease and gluten-free foods because celiac disease is one reason you may not be able to eat them, but there are others. So let us dive in. There we go. So one of the reasons we picked this, and we've talked about it in the past, is because May is Celiac Awareness Month. So definitely a month. I mean, there's a lot of things, food holidays and various public health things we cover, but this is definitely something I think that's important because even if it's not a way you have to eat, knowing for your friends, your family, other people you may be serving food to, it is something to consider. So I'm not going to read through all of these since I will send them out, but this is from Beyond Celiac. Their website's a great resource, and they estimate 133 people in the United States have celiac disease. So it's about 3 million people. It is still considered a small portion of the population, but for those who have it, it's a big deal. So let us keep going. So what is celiac disease? And we're going to touch on celiac disease before we kind of get into gluten specifically. But celiac disease is an autoimmune disorder. Autoimmune disorders are kind of a disruption in our immune system where our body, instead of attacking foreign things that it should attack, it starts to attack our own cells. And in this, when we consume, or somebody with celiac disease consumes gluten, the immune system starts to attack the cells of the small intestine, causing damage. So it's triggered by that ingestion of gluten. There is a strong genetic link. So if you have a first degree relative, odds aren't, you might never develop it, but depending, it's likely you should be tested. And if you have other autoimmune disorders, you are at an increased risk of developing this one as well. There are other names, you'll see it, celiac sprue, gluten sensitivity, enteropathy. So there are some other titles you'll see, but celiac disease is definitely the most commonly used term. The consumption of gluten does damage the lining of the small intestine and causes various symptoms, but even if you don't have symptoms, this damage can still be occurring. And over time, especially if you're not diagnosed, can prevent the absorption of various nutrients. And really, even small, minute, almost invisible quantities of gluten can cause damage. Symptoms. Now, again, some people may go decades without symptoms, or the symptoms can be nondescript. So you might have some bloating that you just can't really describe or pinpoint what food is causing it. Diarrhea, constipation, so a lot of GI symptoms as you'd expect, abdominal pain, but also joint and bone pain, just headaches, brain fog that you just can't shake, canker sores, a dry mouth. You may lose a lot of your tooth enamel. So if that's something like you're not doing other things that would cause that, that could be a sign. Just many different things. And of course, various deficiencies in nutrients that we'll talk about. There's also a skin rash that doesn't occur in everybody with celiac, but it does occur in some. And it's like a little bubbly, prickly rash, often on the backs of arms, on kneecaps. So that's something, if you see this as well, would be kind of a symptom to look out for. How is celiac disease diagnosed? This is a lot on a slide. I'm going to go through it. But just if this is something, especially if you have a family member and are looking to get tested, this is just something to consider. Now, the biggest piece is that if you're really suspecting that you might have celiac disease, it might seem counterintuitive because the only treatment for celiac disease is a strict gluten-free diet. But if you have not yet been tested, you do not want to start that gluten-free diet. This can interfere with the accuracy of the results because what they're testing has to, you have to be consuming gluten for these tests to be accurate. So it does seem like a catch-22, but until you've really gone through this testing, you should definitely continue your normal diet with the help of your healthcare provider and professional. So definitely, if you suspect these symptoms, it's worth a workup. The first thing, of course, being, your healthcare provider, whether it's your primary or if you get referred to a gastroenterologist, they will take your medical history and a physical exam. So discuss those symptoms. Keep a good record. I like keeping my own personal symptoms and things on a note in my phone because I keep my phone with me everywhere I go. You can like have time logs. You can talk about, what foods I've eaten recently. That can be very helpful for when you go into your provider. And you can write questions so you don't forget them when you go into that appointment. Share that family history. Maybe you're not super aware if people were formally diagnosed with celiac disease, but maybe they have a lot of GI concerns. I would still bring them up, or other autoimmune diseases, any relevant medical conditions. Then first, typically, a test you'll have is some genetic testing. It's not diagnostic on its own because you can have genetic traits that do not develop into conditions, but it is often something they will do to see if you have that genetic predisposition. If you do not, often it can help rule out celiac and maybe look into other conditions that it could be. Of course, having these genes does not guarantee that you will develop the condition. Often, you could have the genes for it and never have a trigger that causes you to actually develop the disease. So that's another really important reason to, take care of yourself as much as possible, work on stress management, try not to get various, viral infections because a lot of viral infections can lead to autoimmune disease development. So having a genetic predisposition is not a life sentence for some of these things. Then, if that comes up positive, you'll often, sometimes at the same time as the genetic testing, we'll have blood tests done related to celiac disease. There's a couple different ones, and there's different articles about which ones various organizations find to be the most accurate. But there's a TTG test, an anti-endomysial antibody test. A lot of them are autoantibody tests because, again, this is an autoimmune disorder. Elevated levels suggest that you're having some immune reaction to the gluten. Finally, more often than not, if all of those things are positive or kind of maybe on the edge and they're not sure, the definitive test would be a biopsy of your small intestine, maybe during a colonoscopy or something along those lines. Under a microscope, they'll be able to view those cells and they will see damage of the villi. And those are they're like finger-like projections that go along your small intestine that help move food along, but also help your body bring in and absorb nutrients. If these are damaged, often in celiac disease, instead of them being finger-like, which is really helpful for all of the things they do, they're going to look really flat. And flat villi do not absorb a lot of nutrients. So that is part of how you end up with various deficiencies. So definitely something, again, if you suspect this, you want to be tested because it can cause just so many problems long term. Now, of course, let's say you get all that testing done. You don't have any damage to your intestines, which is so great, good sign, but you still feel off when you are consuming foods that have gluten. There are some other considerations. First is a wheat allergy. This is very different from celiac disease because, again, that's an autoimmune disorder. It has nothing really to do with an allergy. It's a very different reaction. But a wheat allergy is a little different. So this is a different part of the immune system that reacts to proteins that are specifically found in wheat, not always gluten. So what's kind of crazy is that gluten is found in things other than wheat, which we'll talk about, like barley and rye, also have gluten, but they are not wheat. So technically, there are some people who can have barley, but not wheat because they're allergic to wheat. It has nothing to do with gluten. Of course, an allergy is going to have different symptoms. You might have a rash or hives. You might have difficulty breathing. Sometimes it still comes along with GI symptoms like diarrhea, as well, but it'll have more characteristic allergy symptoms. And then one that's a little bit less specific is something called non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So, a sensitivity or intolerance after consuming foods that have gluten. The symptoms can vary, they can also mimic celiac disease, but the real key piece here is that it is not causing damage. So, you do still typically want to be ruled out that you do not have celiac disease or a wheat allergy, because those are very dangerous. Um, and then, more often, let's say you do not have celiac, but you suspect you have a non-celiac gluten sensitivity. There really aren't very many tests to prove that other than an elimination diet. If you feel better not eating gluten foods, and that seems to work for you, certainly that could be the cause. A lot of people follow something called the FODMAP diet, which is not specifically for gluten problems. This is more so for IBS and other types of conditions. And actually, they found it's not the gluten itself that causes GI issues in these people. It's actually some of the sugars that are found in these foods. But again, if you follow an elimination diet and find that those foods, when you reintroduce them, they still don't agree with your system, then yes, there are still people who benefit from not eating it. It's just fortunate that if you happen to accidentally consume gluten, it's not going to end up damaging your small intestine. So definitely a positive there. Now, leading back to the damage that would be caused in your small intestine, what is the problem with that? Now, for people who do not have gluten sensitivities or celiac disease, studies really do show that these individuals who avoid gluten may be risking other parts of their health because gluten-containing foods do contain a good amount of nutrients. So when we take away foods that have gluten and we're not carefully planning our diets to make sure we're making up for those nutrients, we could then be lacking in different things. So, especially whole grains. There are whole grains that do not have gluten, and I will mention them. But a lot of times when we strictly avoid gluten-containing foods, we're missing out on a lot of fiber and a lot of B vitamins. So fiber is really good for our gut health, so you could cause other GI concerns. B vitamins are really important for our energy levels and our blood health and like so many other things. So definitely, if you suspect whether you have celiac or a non-gluten sensitivity, it still might be, or a non-celiac sensitivity, it might be worth, working with a dietitian one-on-one to make sure your diet is still really balanced and that you're getting the nutrients you might be lacking. For people with celiac disease, especially if there's been some damage, common nutrient deficiencies that they may have include iron deficiency. They might not get enough calcium or vitamin D, B12, so again, some of those B vitamins, but B12 is also found in lots of animal products, and then folate as well. So lots of nutrients. It's very common that you may be recommended to take a supplement for some of these because your body might not absorb enough through foods alone. And some people might still need infusions, especially for things like iron and B12. You may have to receive it other ways. Again, so monitoring these and supplementation may be necessary. So again, if you have celiac disease, hopefully you're being followed by a really good gastroenterologist who would be up on these things and making sure maybe you're getting them tested every once in a while to see. Because sometimes for things like B12 in particular, it can take a bit of time for a deficiency to develop. Your body has stores of various things, and it could take some time for them to show up. Same with iron. If you had great stores before, or calcium, your body will be pulling calcium from your bones for a while before you notice that you have an overt deficiency. And so, if we're deficient in these things, things like osteoporosis and anemia caused by that malabsorption can happen more frequently in people who have celiac disease. Okay, so we kind of covered the first bit of our presentation, which is going to be about that celiac disease in particular. Now, for the last half of our presentation, we'll kind of speak to what is gluten and how to avoid it in foods if you personally need to, or how to avoid, especially cross-contamination if you're preparing foods for other people. So, what is gluten? Gluten is the name for a protein. So, gluten is actually a protein that is found in wheat and other gluten-containing grains like rye, barley, triticale, and other kind of compound uh, derivatives of those. Now, it is present in the part of the grain that we call the endosperm. So there's three main parts of a grain, which you can see here in this really nice little picture. So we have the endosperm, the bran, and the germ. When you make a refined grain and you take away some of those great nutrients, you're removing the bran and the germ, which have a lot of healthy fats and fiber, and you're keeping the endosperm. So even if refined grains and whole grains will both have gluten. So you can kind of see here where it's showing the gluten is contained. Now, of course, gluten is naturally occurring in some foods like wheat and barley and rye, but it also is often added as an additive to other foods because I'll show you gluten is very important in food production and serves a lot of purposes. But it also can come into contact with foods through cross contact even though that food may have never had gluten in it. So, also really important to read labels and look for things if you specifically need gluten free. Some words and foods that definitely will have gluten include, obviously, again, wheat. Durum is a common type of wheat that you might find in things like pastas or semolina, you'll often see. Emmer is a type of like ancient wheat variety. Spelt, farina, farro. Farro is a very popular ancient grain, so gluten has been around for a long, long time. But farro, unfortunately, is a gluten-containing grain. Graham, so we think graham crackers, graham flour. There are gluten-free options, but inherently graham is a gluten-containing food. Rye, triticale, which is a derivative of some of these. Pumpernickel, seitan, which is a uh, meat alternative that's made from gluten. So it's super high protein because gluten is a protein, but it is made from gluten. Barley, oh, I list wheat twice because it's just so important. Malt, and then many beers, of course, are going to have gluten. Now, what does gluten do in your body? So, as humans, we have various digestive enzymes that help us break down food. It starts all the way, even before the food goes into your mouth. When you start, like, let's say gluten's a great example. Let's say you walk into the mall and you smell a cinnamon roll or a pretzel. Your body and your mouth, if you start to salivate, you're going to have digestive enzymes already working because your body is anticipating what it's going to need to do. So we have digestive enzymes that really happen throughout the digestive tract. So protease, if you ever see digestive enzymes, they all end in ACE at the end. So protease is the type of enzyme that breaks down protein. That's the easiest one. So that helps break down protein. There are many types of proteins, of course, but proteases cannot completely break down gluten. They just can't. It's just the way they're structured. We break them down some, but not completely. So what this does is that some of that undigested, unbroken down, not the right way to say that, but the whole intact gluten makes its way to your small intestine. So it goes through your esophagus, into your stomach, into the small intestine. Now, most people who do not have celiac disease can handle that undigested gluten just fine, especially in normal amounts that we consume. Gluten actually can even function in those people as a prebiotic. So if you joined me yesterday, I think I mentioned prebiotic fibers are really good for our gut bacteria. It can actually help feed them. So truly, gluten can be a positive thing in people who do not have celiac disease. But if you do have celiac disease, that intact gluten hanging around in that small intestine triggers that autoimmune response and all of those nasty symptoms and damage that come along with it. So this is kind of just the cascading what can happen in your body depending on if you tolerate gluten or if you do not. So again, gluten is not a bad thing for all people. So that's an important piece to call out. Now, what is gluten's role in food? Why is it even there? So as I mentioned, gluten is naturally occurring and it always has been. However, it can be extracted and concentrated and added to foods to add protein, because again, we're all protein obsessed nowadays. So it can add protein to other foods. It can make the texture better or different, and it can add flavor as well. These breads look so good too. Uh, Gluten also works as a binding agent to help some processed foods stay together and keep their shape. It can work as a thickener and a stabilizer. And especially in bread that we think of, gluten, the proteins in there, actually help form that like elastic network that when you cut open a piece of bread and you see kind of the little holes and circles and things, that's the gluten molecules kind of stretching. If you've ever kneaded dough, you kind of can see some of them already starting to form when the bread rises. All of those, kind of holes in there help trap gas, and this allows the bread to rise and also helps keep moisture in. So definitely a very important compound in certain types of food. And that's why, especially in a lot of gluten-free foods, you're going to find a lot of other additives and things to try to just replicate what gluten does naturally. And again, Vital Wheat gluten or seitan, a meat substitute, is made from gluten. You'll see, I think in our natural organic section, I think we even have a Nature's Promise version. You'll see a meat substitute that's called that. So definitely look out if you have any gluten issues. Now, what foods will have and won't have gluten? So people with celiac disease, as I've kind of harped on, wheat, barley, rye, their derivatives like triticale. Anything with those, you're gonna want to watch out for. This is going to include regular breads, pastas, cereals, baked goods, sauces, processed foods, things you might not even think. Like, soy sauce is definitely, so that typically has wheat unless it calls out that it's a gluten-free food. A lot of, mixes and different things might have wheat powder or wheat flour in there, again, as a thickener or something. So you're going to, let's say you normally thicken your gravy with some type of very fine flour. If you need to be gluten-free, you're gonna have to do that with something other than flour, like cornstarch or potato starch. There are tons of different options, but it's just something, if it's not on the top of your mind, kind of have to make it and think through every food package. Now, of course, having celiac disease and having to avoid gluten, especially in our world, can be very difficult and daunting, especially when you're first getting started. But there are also so many foods that are naturally gluten-free. And I think with any diagnosis, especially when it comes to food, having that mentality of what foods can I have versus what can I not have is the first, positive way to think of it. So fruits and vegetables in their plain, regular way, whether it's fresh, frozen, or canned. Frozen, definitely watching out for sauces and thickeners and things that could potentially have gluten, but in their own state, fruits and vegetables are gluten-free. Meat and poultry, fish and seafood. The only times I would really watch out any cross-contamination that could occur or breaded products. So of course, like a chicken nugget, you want to make sure you're looking for a gluten-free option. Dairy foods, yogurts and milks, cheeses are inherently gluten-free, but there are some, yogurts that have the little mix-ins and things which would contain gluten, of course. Beans, nuts and seeds, and of course, gluten-free grains, which I think I have on one of our next slides. Yeah, on my next slide. So gluten-free grains are what we call pseudo grains, meaning botanically, like they're not actually grains, but we consume them as grains. Rice is going to be gluten-free. Cassava, yuca, especially those can help thicken things. Corn is gluten-free, whether you eat it as a vegetable or as a grain. Soy, potato. So I mentioned potato starch, or potatoes are just really great at thickening things. Tapioca, beans, sorghum is a great one. Quinoa. So quinoa is technically not a grain, it's a seed, but we eat it very often as a grain. Millet, buckwheat. You'll also see it in kasha is a name you'll see in Giant. I think I looked up one. Buckwheat, even though it has the word wheat in it, it is not wheat. It is the word buckwheat. Very confusing, but it's not gluten containing. Arrowroot, amaranth, teff, seeds like flax, chia, and hemp. Gluten-free oats. So I do have an asterisk here because some people with celiac and non-celiac gluten sensitivity react to a type of protein that's also found in oats. But a lot of brands do call out that they're gluten-free oats, like Bob's Red Mill is a really great one. So that's something to look out for. In theory, oats will not have gluten. It could be on the same lines, or you could be cross-reacting to the protein in oats. And then nut flours, of course, can be a good alternative to gluten-containing grains. Now, how can we avoid cross-contamination, or technically called cross-contact, where you may have a gluten-free food that comes in contact with a gluten-containing food? So let's say you have a family member, someone who lives in your household that was recently diagnosed with celiac disease, but not everybody in the household is, so you don't intend to just completely cut out gluten from your kitchen. Of course, there are some things you really want to do to help the person who has celiac disease. One of the first things you want to do, I would really do a deep clean of your cabinets and your pantry and whatever else, maybe your shelves of your refrigerator. Make sure everything's clean. Then you want to store gluten-free foods above gluten-containing foods because, if you've ever had a bag of flour, sometimes it just goes everywhere. You want to make sure that is under anything that has no gluten because you don't want any flour particles falling on top of the gluten-free foods because truly the smallest amount can cause damage. Keep those cooking surfaces and food storage areas clean, wash your hands between things, wear gloves, and change them at appropriate times. The dishwasher, especially if it is maintained in, the right temperature and the right consistency of the detergents, can help remove particles. So this is something I recommend and things I have seen, especially for people who have celiac disease. Having two of certain tools, things like cutting boards and colanders that have gluten-containing foods in them. So again, if you're using a dishwasher, it should probably be okay. But let's say you have a colander that you're pouring gluten-containing pasta into, and it wasn't washed really, really well. And then somebody who can't have gluten pours their gluten-free pasta into it. There is the potential for contamination. In a toaster, so you're probably not always cleaning the grates in your toaster. So if you have a toaster oven, tends to be a little bit safer. Maybe putting down some foil or cooking it on a thing that can be washed can be helpful, or having separate toasters if you toast a lot of stuff. Same with a grill. And then this is something I think people don't always think about, either buying squeezable condiments. So let's say it's like mayo. Instead of dipping your knife into the mayo and then spreading it on your gluten-containing bread, sticking it back into the container, you're introducing gluten into that once gluten-free product. So either make sure you scoop it out without touching the bread, so that you're not doing that, or having squeezable things. There are squeezable mayos out there, and that can help prevent any excess contamination that might occur. So just being as aware of what you're doing as possible in the kitchen can be very helpful. Now, again, there are so many foods and things you can eat that are inherently gluten-free, or it just takes some changing to make sure that the foods are. So a lot of foods you can still have, or just with some tweaks, like instead of, cream of wheat, for example, is not going to be a food you can have, but maybe you're going to make gluten-free oatmeal. That's an easy one. Or quinoa porridge. Cooking quinoa as a breakfast cereal, a warm cereal, is delicious. Making a breakfast sandwich with, gluten-free bread or a gluten-free waffle or pancake. Lunch, very simple. A lot of lunches, again, gluten-free bread would be an option. Making a stir fry with whatever you would have normally made a stir fry with, but just making sure you're serving it over rice, using gluten-free soy sauce or tamari, reading those sauces because that can be a big food that can have gluten. Dinner, any baked fish or other proteins, tofu, whatever you like. Roasted veggies, again, making sure the sauce is gluten-free. A spaghetti dinner with, a gluten-free or a bean-based pasta. And then chili or other types of things, making sure the seasoning packet is gluten-free because I did find one that had wheat flour, but McCormick did also have a gluten-free one. So just, unless you can also just use chili powder and cumin and use the individual spices as well. I know there's a lot of pictures on this, but just some of our favorite gluten-free products from our own brands and national brands. So we have gluten-free chicken patties and chicken nuggets. One of my favorite products is the Bob's Red Mill one-to-one baking flour. So this you can use in place of all-purpose flour in just about anything you're making. It is such a great swap. Bragg's liquid aminos is a soy sauce alternative that is gluten-free. I love this Barilla chickpea pasta. So a lot of gluten-free pastas are made with rice flour and things that unfortunately do not have a lot of fiber. And if you also happen to have diabetes or something else you're managing, you want to still have that good fiber and protein. So I love this single ingredient pasta made from chickpeas. They also have a lentil one. I recently tried this gluten-free bread for the first time. I thought it was quite good. We toasted it. I don't know if it was super great not toasted, but this base culture was very good. It does have eggs, just for people who can't have eggs. We have panko breadcrumbs that are gluten-free, a lot of corn tortillas and things, check, but are typically inherently gluten-free. And then I talked about these Kodiak gluten-free pancake and waffle mix last month. Delicious. I think it was the best gluten-free pancake mix I have tried. So definitely a great one. You can make a ton of different things, muffins, pancakes, of course, waffles, of course, but really great. On our website, we have both for Giant and Martin's a page dedicated to gluten-free foods. And of course, our well-being page, we have one for, I think it says allergies or intolerances, and one of them lists gluten-free. So great resources on our website. And of course, when you're on our website or in our app searching for particular foods, you can search for gluten-free products. So make sure you turn that filter on. I only have like one more slide, I promise. You can also, of course, in our recipe database for savory, uh, so this, how many are here? 467 recipes that earn 1, 2, or 3 guiding stars. And I filtered for gluten and wheat free. There wasn't a big difference because they're pretty similar, but that's plenty of recipes to kind of give you inspiration and better for you ones too. There are tons of different celiac disease resources out there if you're feeling overwhelmed and or again, if you have a family member or a friend or you just want to learn more for other people, there are tons of great resources from Beyond Celiac, Celiac Disease Foundation, Gluten Intolerance Group, and the National Foundation for Celiac Awareness. All great websites. Okay, so my final slide and a recap. So celiac disease itself requires a completely gluten-free diet as the primary treatment. Truly, even if you do not have symptoms, small cross-contamination can still lead to damage. And yes, again, you might not feel it, but it is happening and can cause malabsorption, can potentially cause, certain types of cancers long term. So there's lots of reasons to definitely avoid as much gluten as possible completely. Those without celiac disease or those other conditions I mentioned truly do not benefit from a gluten-free diet. There are reasons gluten is in our food, and possibly it even works as a prebiotic fiber, which is definitely beneficial for gut health. So if you do not have celiac disease or a non-celiac gluten sensitivity, or you're not following a FODMAP diet, truly, and you don't feel awful when you eat it, certainly it is not the thing everybody needs to give up. And many foods, fortunately, are gluten-free. And if you're cooking for somebody who is, just make sure you're aware and you're reading those food labels and reach out to our team if you ever have questions about, is this food gluten-free? We can help you figure it out. And if not, what is an alternative? We love doing stuff like that. So always reach out to us. That is all I have. Thank you so much for joining me today.